Are we alive? Yes, we are alive. We are alive. We are going to cheeseburgers. Ow. Oh my god, I can't believe it. It's time to do 1984, bound again by the book. Wanna know what's weird? Wanna know what's annoying? Chapter 9, 1 hour, 40 minutes long. Like they couldn't split this in two chapters, but it's an author choice. What's the part that's annoying is that I have to read this and yeah. You know what? I want to do what? Hey ChatGPT, what's 1 hour 40 minutes divided by two? 1 hour divided by 40, 1 hour 40 minutes equals 100 minutes. 100 divided by 2 equals 50 minutes. So the result is 0 hours 50 minutes. So basically, when we hit the 50-minute mark, then we're good. Also, yeah, Penguin Jam and stuff. Anyways, Winston was gelatinous with fatigue. Gelatinous was the right word. It had come into his head spontaneously. His body seemed to have not only the weakness of a jelly, but its translucency. He felt that if he held up his hand, he would be able to see the light through it. All the blood and lymph had been drained out of him by an enormous debulk of work, leaving only a frail structure of nerves, bones, and skin. All sensations seemed to be magnified. His overalls fretted his shoulders, the pavement tickled his feet. Even the opening and closing of a hand was an effort that made his joints creak. He had worked more than 90 hours in 5 days, so had everyone else in the ministry. Now it was all over, and he had literally nothing to do, no party work of any description, until tomorrow morning. He could spend 6 hours in the hiding place, and another 9 in his own bed. Slowly, in the mid-afternoon sunshine, he walked up a dingy street in the direction of Mr. Charrington's shop, keeping one eye open for the patrols, but irrationally convinced that this afternoon there was no danger of anyone interfering with him. The heavy briefcase that he was carrying bumped against his knee at each step, sending a tingling sensation up and down the skin of his leg. Inside it was the book, which he had now had in possession for 6 days and had not yet opened nor even looked at. On the 6th day of 8 week, after the processions, the speeches, the shouting, the singing, the banners, the posters, the films, the waxworks, the rolling of drums and squealing of trumpets, the tramp of marching feet, the grinding of the caterpillars of tanks, the roar of massed planes, the booming of guns after 6 days of this, when the great orgasm was quivering into its climax, and the general hatred of Eurasia had boiled up into such delirium that if the crowd could have got their hands on the 2,000 Eurasian war criminals who were to be publicly hanged on the last day of the proceedings, they would unquestionably have torn them to pieces. At just this moment it had been announced that Oceania was not after all at war with Eurasia. Oceania was at war with Eastasia. Eurasia was an ally. There was, of course, no admission that any change had taken place. Merely it became known with extreme suddenness and everywhere at once that Eastasia and not Eurasia was the enemy. Winston was taking part in a demonstration in one of the central London squares at the moment when it happened. It was night and the white faces and the scarlet banners were luridly floodlit. The square was packed with several thousand people, including a block of about 1,000 schoolchildren in their uniform as spies. On a scarlet-draped platform, an orator of the inner party, a small lean man with disproportionately long arms and a large bald skull, over with a few lank locks straggled, was haranguing with the crowd. A little Rumpelstiltskin figure, contorted with hatred, had gripped the neck of the microphone with one hand with the other, enormous the end of a bony arm, clawed the air menacingly above his head. His voice, made metallic by the amplifier, boomed forth the endless catalogue of atrocities, massacres, deportation, looting, rapings, torture of prisoners, bombing of civilians, lying propaganda, unjust aggressions, broken treaties. It was almost impossible to listen to him without being first convinced and then maddened. At every few moments the fury of the crowd boiled over and the voice of the speaker was drowned by a wild beast-like roaring that rose uncontrollably from thousands of throats. The most savage yells of all came from the schoolchildren. The speech had been proceeding for perhaps 20 minutes when a messenger hurried onto the platform and a scrap of paper was slipped into the speaker's hand. He unrolled and read it without pausing in his speech. Nothing altered in his voice or manner or in the context of what he was saying, but suddenly their names was different. Without words said, a wave of understanding rippled through the crowd. Oceania was at war with East Asia. The next moment there was a tremendous commotion. The banners and posters with which the square was decorated were all wrong. Quite half of them had the wrong faces on them. It was sabotage. The agents of Goldstein had been at work. There was a rituous interlude while posters were ripped from the walls, banners torn to shreds and trampled underfoot. The spies performed prodigies of activity in clambering over the rooftops and cutting the streamers that flared from the chimneys, but within 2 or 3 minutes it was all over. The orator, still gripping the neck of the microphone, his shoulders hunched forward, his free hand clawing at the air, had gone straight on with his speech. 1 minute more, and the feral roars of rage were again bursting from the crowd. The hate continued exactly as before, except the target had been changed. The thing that impressed Winston in looking back was that the speaker had switched from one line to the other, at actually in mid-sentence, not only without a pause, but without even breaking the syntax. But at the moment he had other things to preoccupy him. It was during the moment of disorder while the posters were being torn down and that a man whose face he did not see had tapped on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, I think you've dropped your briefcase." He took the briefcase abstractedly without speaking. He knew that it would be days before he had an opportunity to look inside it. The instant that the demonstration was over, he went straight to the Ministry of Truth. Though the time was now nearly 23 hours, the entire staff of the ministry had done likewise. The orders already issuing from the telescreen, recalling them to their posts, were hardly necessary. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. A large part of the political literature of the 5 years was now completely obsolete. Reports and records of all kinds, newspapers, books, pamphlets, films, soundtracks, photographs, all had to be rectified at lightning speed. Although no directive was ever issued, it was known that the chiefs of department intended that within 1 week no reference to the war with Eurasia or the alliance with East Asia should remain in existence anywhere. The work was overwhelming. Hang on, am I still? No, God damn it, I'm in the wrong post. I did not, wait, hang on, yeah, I did. God damn it. Overwhelming. All of them more so because the process that it involved could not be called by their true names. Everyone in the records department worked 18 hours into 24, with 3-hour snatches of sleep. Mattresses were brought up from the cellars and pitched all over the corridors. Meals consisted of sandwiches and victory coffee wheeled round on trolleys by attendants from the canteen. Each time that Winston broke off for one of his spells of sleep, he tried to leave his desk clear of work, and each time that he crawled back, s- stick, sticky-eyed and aching, it was to find that another shower of paper cylinders had covered the desk like a snowdrift, half burying the speakwrite and overflowing onto the floor, so that the first job was always to stack them in a neat enough pile to give him room to work. Well, what was worst of all was the work was by no means purely mechanical. Often it was enough merely to substitute one name for another, but any detailed report of events demanded care and imagination. Even the geographical knowledge that one needed in transferring the war from one part of the world to another was considerable. By the third day his eyes ached unbearably and his spectacles needed the wiping every few minutes. It was like struggling with some crushing physical task, something which one had the right to refuse and which one nevertheless neurotically anxious to accomplish. In so far as he had time to remember it, he was not troubled by the fact that every word he murmured into the speakwrite, every stroke of his ink pencil, was a deliberate lie. He wasn't anxious as anyone else in the department that the forgery should be perfect. On the morning of the sixth day, the dribble of cylinders slowed down. For as much as half an hour, nothing came out of the tube. Then one more cylinder, then nothing. Everywhere at about the same time, work was easing off. A deep and as it were secret sigh went through the department. A mighty deed which could never be mentioned had been achieved. It was now impossible for any human being to prove by documentary evidence that the war with Eurasia had ever happened. At 1200 it was unexpectedly announced that all workers in the ministry were free till tomorrow morning. Winston, still carrying the briefcase containing the book, which had remained between his feet while he worked and under his body while he slept, went home, shaved himself, and almost fell asleep in his bath, although the water was barely more than tepid. With a sort of voluptuous creaking in his joints, he climbed the stair above Mr. Charrington's shop. He was tired, but not asleep any longer. He opened a window, lit the dirty little oil stove, and put on a pan of water for coffee. Julia would arrive presently. Meanwhile, there was the book. He sat down in the sluttish armchair and undid the straps of the briefcase. A heavy black volume, amateurish, amateurishly bound, with no name or title on the cover. The print also looked slightly irregular. The pages were worn at the edges and fell apart easily as though the book had passed through many hands. The inscription on the page ran, "The Theory and Practice of or Oligarchical Collectivism" by Emmanuel Goldstein. "Let's go read a book in the book. It's a meta book." Winston began reading. Chapter 1. Ignorance is Strength. Throughout the record time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there had been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been hang on, subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their attitude towards one another, have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these groups are entirely irreconcilable. Winston stopped reading chiefly in order to appreciate the fact that he was reading in comfort and safety. Here's alone, no telescreen, no ear at the keyhole, no nervous impulse to glance over his shoulder or cover the page with his hand. The sweet summer air played against his cheek. From somewhere far away there floated the faint shouts of children. In the room itself there was no sound except the insect voice of the clock. He settled deeper into the armchair and put his feet upon the fender. It was bliss, it was eternity. Suddenly, as one sometimes does with a book, which one knows that one will ultimately read and reread every word, he opened it at a different place and found himself at chapter 3. That's how fast I want to read. He went on reading. Chapter 3. War is Peace. The splitting up of the world into three great superstates was an event which could be and indeed was foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. Within the absorption of Europe by Russia and of the British Empire by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were already effectively in being. The third, East Asia, only emerged as a distinct until after another decade of confused fighting. The frontiers between the three superstates are in some places arbitrary, and in others they fluctuate according to the fortunes of war, but in general they follow geographical lines. Eurasia comprises the whole of the northern part of the European and Asiatic landmass, from Portugal to the Bering Strait. Oceania composes the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, including the British Isles, Australasia, and the southern portion of Africa. East Asia, smaller than the others and with a less definite western frontier, composes China and the countries to the south of it, the Japanese islands, and a large but fluctuating portion of. Is that a lot of meta book inside? But fluctuating portion of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war and have been so far for the past 25 years. However, war, however, is no longer desperate annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It was a warfare limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. This is to not this is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitude towards it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such as raping, looting, the slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners which extend even to boiling and burying alive are looked upon as normal and, when they are committed by one's own side and not the enemy, meritorious. But in a physical sense, war involves very small numbers of people, mostly high-trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on the vague frontiers whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at, or rounding the floating fortress which guards strategic spots on the sea lanes. Hang on, before I continue, the mode changed again. I'll I'll change back the mode. More time left in book. I want time left in chapter. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed in their order of importance. Motives which were already present to some small extent in the great wars of the early 20th century have now become dominant and are consciously recognized and acted upon. To understand the nature of the present war, for in spite of the regrouping which occurs every few years, it is always the same war. One must realize in the first place that it is impossible for it to be decisive. None of the three superstates could be definitively conquered by the other two in combination. They are too evenly matched, and their natural defenses are too formidable. Eurasia is protected by its vast land spaces, Oceania by the width of the Atlantic and the Pacific, East Asia by the vicinity and industriousness of its inhabitants. Secondly, there is no longer in a material sense anything to fight about. With the establishment of self-contained economies in which production and consumption are geared to one another, the scramble for markets, which was the main cause of previous wars, has come to an end, while the competition for raw materials is no longer a matter of life and death. In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast that... why do I have to read them in a book? In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast I can it can obtain almost all the materials that it needs within its own boundaries, and so far as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is the war for labor power between the frontiers of the superstates and not permanently in possession of any of them. There lies a West Quadrilateral with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong, containing within it about 50 of the population of the Earth. It is for the possession of these thickly populated regions and of the northern ice cap that the three powers are constantly struggling. In practice, no one power ever controls the whole of the disputed area. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and it is to chance of seizing this or that fragment by a sudden stroke of treachery that dictates the endless changes of alignments. All of the disputed territories contain valuable materials, and some of them yield important vegetable products such as rubber, which in colder climates it is necessary to synthesize by a comparatively expensive methods. But above all, they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. Whichever power controls equatorial Africa, or the countries of the Middle East, or southern Indian... Within today, our archipelago disposes also the bodies of scores or hundreds of millions of ill-paid and also hardworking coolies. The inhabitants of the area reduced more or less openly to the statues of the slaves, pass continuously from the conqueror to conqueror, and are expended like so much coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labor power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on indefinitely. It should be noted that the fighting never really moves beyond the end of the edge of the disputed areas. The frontiers of Eurasia flow back and forth between the basin of the Congo and the northern shore of the Mediterranean. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are constantly being captured and recaptured by Oceania and East Asia. In Mongolia, the dividing line between Eurasia and East Asia is never stable. Round the pole, all three powers lay claim to enormous territories, which in fact are largely uninhabited and unexplored. But the balance of power always remains roughly even, and the territory which forms the heartland of each superstate always remains inviolate. Moreover, the labor of the exploited peoples around the equator is not really necessary to the world's economy. They add nothing to the wealth of the world, since whatever they produce is used for purposes of war, and the object is always to be in a better position in which to wage another war. By labor to the enslaved populations allow the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not realize the structure of the world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principle of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is to use without of the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, how many meta book is there? Hang on. Oh my god. It's an entire goddamn book! Oh my god! Where was I? So, the last word I remember. Okay, that was the image. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, the problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so, even if no artificial process of destruction had been at work. The world of today is a bare, hungry, depleted place compared with the world that existed before 1914, and still more so if compared with the imaginary future to which the people of that period looked forward. Actually, before I continue, I just want to create a poll real quick. Let me just try and do something. I want a poll. Poll. Copy. Now. Yes, yes. No, no. Confirm. It should last until like duration is timer in seconds. What is 20 minutes in seconds? Okay, it's confirm. Okay, I will continue reading. Hang on. Reading. Okay, I want browser. Bam, bam, bam. And then I will start a very important poll. You have the choice to make me suffer or the choice to do otherwise. Okay, there should be a poll now. Vote yes if you want me to skip the meta book. Vote no if you don't want if you want me to make if you want to make me suffer. Meanwhile, I'll go take a small break. This will affect the future stream, like the next stream. Yeah. Have fun. Anyways, yeah. Sorry for the quick break. But if we do skip the meta book, I will provide a summary. If I don't, then I will still provide a summary. Probably. I don't know. But like, come on. It's a giant meta book in the book. And it's not usually supposed to last like, I don't know. No, it's gross. I'm reading. The world of today is bare, hungry, depraved place compared to the world of its night forward, if more so compared with the imaginary future to which the people of that period looked forward. In the earliest 20th century, the version of a future society, unbelievably rich, leisured, orderly, and efficient, a glittering, antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow-white concrete was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at a prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that it would go on developing. This failed to happen partly because of the impoverishment caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partly because scientific and technical progress depended on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly reimagined society. As a whole, the world is more primitive today than it was 50 years ago. Certain backward areas have advanced and various devices, always in some way connected with warfare and political espionage, have been developed, but and invention have largely stopped, and the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers intent in the machine are still there. From the moment with the machine first made its appearance and was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, has disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that, and hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations, and in fact without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process by producing wealth which was sometimes impossible not to distribute, the machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But it was also clear that an all-round increase in wealth threatened the destruction. Indeed, in some sense, was the destruction of a hierarchical society. In a world which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an aeroplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. I don't know how to pronounce that word. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable, for if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would never learn and I mean not never learn, and would learn to think for themselves. And once they have done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practicable solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive towards almost the whole world, and moreover, any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense and was bound to be dominated, directly or indirectly, by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation, capital equipment was not added to, great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by the state charity. But this too entailed military weakness, and since the privations inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turnable. Wait, no, no, turning. Without increasing the real wealth of the world, goods must be produced, but they must not be distributed. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering into pieces, or pouring into the stratosphere, or sinking into the depths of the sea, materials which might be otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor their powers without producing anything that can be consumed. A floating fortress, for example, has locked up and yet the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately, it is scrapped as obsolete, never having brought any material benefit to anybody. And with further enormous labors, another floating fortress is built. In principle, the war effort is always so planned to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. In practice, hang on. In practice, the needs of population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of have the necessities of life, but this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. By the standards of the early 20th century, even a member of the inner party lives an austere, laborious kind of life. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better texture of his clothes, the better quality of his food and drink and tobacco, with his two or three servants, his private motor car or helicopter, set him in a different world from a member of the outer party, and the members of the outer party have a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consciousness. Come on, do we barely got anyway. Come on. And therefore danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. What is concerned here is not the morality of masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they kept steadily at work, but but the moral of the party itself. Even with the humblest party member, it is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent with narrow limits. But it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgiastic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the men, mentality appropriate to a state of war. It does not matter whether the war is actually happening, and since no decisive victory is possible, it does not matter whether the war is going well or badly. All that is needed is that a state of war should exist. The splitting of the intelligence which the party requires of its members. Actually, before I continue, I'm just gonna break time again. Sorry. But I will advertise. That's what I want to do. The poll's still empty. So, 5 minutes break. Once again, I will still leave my mic open because I still want to chat. Hey, Koopa Construction. Poll. Hey, that server. Poll. Hey, Agents of Fire Nice, Curse Level Global Community. Where's my thing? Wham. Poll. Hey, Turbo Warp people. Poll. Who else is left? Poll. Not GD rated layouts, not Eidolon, not idle skilling, not Lion's Tail bottom, not Discord PY, not Hypixel, not Discord Town Hall, not Discord developers, not Fangame. No. No, there's not much else where I can advertise. But I'll assume it's alright. In any case, I'll still do it on Facebook. Facebook.com. Oh, oh my god, I realized I'm still wasting time for the poll. I assume I'm gonna settings. Yes, great. I'm gonna stop the break. Let's continue reading. The splitting of the intelligence which the party requires of its members and which is more easily achieved in an atmosphere of war is now almost universal, but the higher up ranks one goes, the more marked it becomes. It is precisely the inner party that the war hysteria and hatred of the enemy are strongest. In his capacity as an administrator, it is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious and either not happening or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared one. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party wavers for an instant his mystical belief that the war is real and that it is bound to end victoriously with Oceanity undisputed master of the entire world. All members of the inner party believe in this coming conquest as an article of faith. It is to be achieved either by gradually acquiring more and more territory and so building up an overwhelming preponderance of power, or by the discovery of some new and unanswerable weapon. Search for new weapons continues increasingly, and it is one of the very few remaining activities in which the inventive of speculative or speculative spec type mind can fit in any outlet. In Oceania at the present day, sincere science in the old sense had almost ceased to exist. In Newspeak, there is no words for science. The empirical method of thought on which all the scientific achievements of the past were founded is opposed to the most fundamental principles of Ingsoc, and even technological progress only happens when its products can in some way be used for the diminution of human liberty. In all the useful arts, the world is either standing still or going backwards. The fields are cultivated with horse plows, while books are written by machinery. But in matters of vital importance, meaning, in effect, war and police, espionage, the empire, the empirical approach is still encouraged, or at least tolerated. The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth, and to extinguish once for all the possibility of independent thought. There are therefore two great problems which the party is concerned to solve. One is how to discover, against his will, what another human being is thinking. And yet there is how to kill several hundred million people in a few seconds without giving well warning beforehand. Insofar as scientific research still continues, that this is the subject matter. The scientist of today is either a mixture of psychologist and inquisitor, studying with real ordinary minuteness the meaning of facial expressions, gestures, and tones of voice, and testing the truth-producing effects of drugs, shock therapy, hypnosis, and physical torture, or he is chemist, physicist, or biologist concerned only with such branches of his special subject and as are relevant to the taking of life in the vast laboratories of the Ministry of Peace and in the experimental stations hidden in the Brazilian forests or in the Australian desert or on the lost islands of the Antarctic. The teams of experts indefatigably at work. Some are concerned simply with planning the logistics of future wars, others devise larger and larger rocket bombs and more powerful explosives, and more impenetrable armor plating. Others search for new and deadlier gases, for soluble poisons capable of being produced in such quantities as to destroy the vegetation of whole continents, or for breeds of disease germs immunized against all possible antibodies. Others strive to produce a vehicle that shall bore its way under the soil like a submarine under the water, or an airplane as independent of its base as a sailing ship. Others explore even remoter possibilities, such as focusing the sun's rays through lenses suspended to thousands of kilometers away in space, or producing artificial earthquakes and tidal waves by tapping the heat of the Earth's center. But none of these projects ever comes anywhere near realization, and none of the three superstates ever gains a significant lead on the others. What is more remarkable is that all three powers already possessed in their atomic bomb a weapon far more powerful than any of that their present researchers are likely to discover. Although the party, according to its habit, claims the invention for itself, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s, and were the first used on a large scale about 10 years later. At the time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped on industrial cities, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe, and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that then a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of unorganized society, and hence of their own power thereafter, although no formal agreement that was ever made or hinted at no more bombs were dropped. All three powers merely continued to produce atomic bombs and store them up against the device opportunity, which they all believe will come sooner or later. And meanwhile, the art of war has remained almost stationary for 3 or 40 years. For no, 30 or 40 years. Helicopters are more used than they were formerly, bombing planes that have been largely superseded by self-propelled projectiles, and the fragile movable battleship have given way to the almost unsinkable floating fortress, but otherwise there has been little development. The tank, the submarine, the torpedo, the machine gun, even the rifle and the hand grenade are still in use, and in spite of the endless slaughters reported in the press and on the telescreens, the desperate battles of earlier wars, in which hundreds of thousands or even millions of men were often killed in a few weeks, have never been repeated. None of the three superstates even attempts any maneuver which involved the risk of serious defeat. When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack against an ally. The strategy that all three powers are following, or pretend to themselves that they are following, is the same. The plan is, by a combination of fighting, bargaining, and a well-timed strokes of treachery, to acquire a ring of bases completely encircling one or other of the rival states, and then to sign a pact of friendship with that rival and remain on peaceful terms for so many years as to lull suspicion to sleep. During this time, rockets loaded with atomic bombs can be assembled at all the strategic spots. Finally, they will all be fired simultaneously, with effects so devastating as to make retaliation impossible. It will then be time to sign a pact of friendship with the remaining world power in preparation for another attack. This scheme it is hardly necessary to say it is a mere daydream, impossible of realization. Moreover, no fighting ever occurs except in the disputed areas around the equator and the pole. No invasion of enemy territory is ever undertaken. This explains the fact that in some places the frontiers between the superstates are arbitrary. Eurasia, for example, could easily conquer the British Isles, which are geographically part of Europe, or on the other hand it would be possible for Oceania to push itself frontiers to the Rhine or even to Vistula. But this would violate the principle followed on all sides, though never formulated, of cultural integrity. If Oceania were to conquer the areas that was to be known as France and Germany, it was to be necessary to either to exterminate the inhabitants, a task of great physical difficulty, or to assimilate the population of about 100 million people who, so far as technical development goes, are roughly on the oceanic level. The problem is that this is the same for all three superstates. It is absolutely necessary to the structure that there should be no contact with foreigners, except to a limited extent with war prisoners and colored slaves. Oh my god, it has racism in the book. What the hell? Even the official ally of the moment is always regarded with the darkest suspicion. With war prisoners apart, the average citizen of Vienna never sets eyes on a citizen of either Eurasia or East Asia, and he is forbidden the knowledge of foreign languages. If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself and that most of what he has been told about them is lies. The sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his morale depends might evaporate. Hang on, the poll finished. How'd the poll go? Poll. No, poll. Nobody voted! I'm open this again. Yeah, you get to vote on the poll for until the end of the stream. If if that doesn't happen, then I will have control of the stuff. Yeah, just please vote on the poll. I don't know if you can still vote, but despite that. Anyways, forbidden knowledge of foreign languages. If he were allowed to contact with foreigners, he was such a creature similar to himself and had no most of what he has been told about them is lies. That the sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his morale depends might evaporate. It is therefore realized on all sides that however often Persia or Egypt or Java or Ceylon may change hands, the main frontiers must never be crossed by anything except bombs. Under the under this lies a fact never mentioned aloud, but tactily understood and acted upon, namely that the conditions of life in all three superstates are very much the same. In Oceania, the prevailing philosophy is called Ingsoc. In Eurasia, it is called Bolshevism, and in East Asia, it is called by a Chinese name usually translated as death worship, but perhaps better rendered as obliteration of the self. The citizen of Oceania is not allowed to know anything of the tenets of the other two philosophies, but he is taught to execrate them as barbarous outrages upon morality and common sense. Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and the societal system which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramidal structure, the same worship of semi-divine leader, the same economy existing by and for continuous warfare. It follows the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop one another up like three sheaves on corn. And unusual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they are doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. Meanwhile, the fact that there is no danger of conquest makes possible the denial of reality, which is a special feature of Ingsoc and its rival systems of thought. Here it is necessary to repeat what had been said earlier, then that by becoming continuous war had been fundamentally changed its character. In past ages, almost a war, almost by definition, was something that sooner or later come to an end, usually in an unmistakable victory or defeat. In the past, also, war was one of the main instruments that by which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. All rulers and ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency, so long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable. The precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy, or religion, or ethics, or politics, two and two might make five, but when one was designing a gun or aeroplane, they had to make four. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. Newspapers and history books were, of course, always colored and biased, but falsification of the kind that is practiced today would have been impossible. War was a sure safeguard of sanity, and so far as the ruling classes were concerned, it was probably the most important of all safeguards. While wars could be won or lost, no ruling class could be completely irresponsible. But when war becomes literally continuous, it also ceases to be dangerous. When war is continuous, there is no such thing as military necessity. Technical progress can cease, and the most palpable facts can be denied or disregarded. As we have seen, researches that could be called scientific are still carried out for the purposes of war, but they're essentially a kind of daydreaming, and their failure to show results that it is not important. Efficiency, even military efficiency, is no longer needed. Nothing is efficient in Oceania except the Star Police. Since each of the three superstates is unconquerable, each in effect of a separate universe within which almost any preservation of thought can be safely practiced. Reality only exerts its pressures through the needs of everyday life, the need to eat and drink, to get shelter and clothing, to avoid swallowing poison or stepping out of top-story windows, and the like. Between life and death, and between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact with the other world and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space, who has no way of knowing which direction is up and which is down. The rulers of such estates are absolute, and the pharaohs of the Caesars could not be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient, and they are obliged to remain at the same low level of military technique as their rivals. But once that minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose. The war, therefore, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, is merely an imposture. It is like the battles between certain ruminant animals, whose horns are set at such an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It eats up the surplus of consumable goods, and it helps preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. What page are we? Alright, 173. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interests and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of war is not to make or prevent conquest of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. It would probably be accurate to say that by becoming continuous war had ceased to exist. The peculiar pressure that it exerted on human beings between the Neolithic age and the early 20th century had disappeared and been replaced by something quite different. The effect would be much the same if the three superstates, instead of fighting one another, should agree to live in perpetual peace, each inviolate within its own boundaries, for in that case each would still be a self-contained universe, freed forever be freed forever from the souring influence of external danger. A peace that was truly permanent would be the same as a permanent war. This also the vast majority of the parties understand it only in a shallower sense is the inner meaning of the party slogan, War is Peace. Winston stopped finally the end of the meta book. Winston stopped reading for a moment. Somewhere in remote distance a rocket bomb thundered. The blissful feeling of being alone with the forbidden book in a room with no telescreen had not worn off. Solitude and safety were physical sensations mixed up somehow with the tiredness of his body, the softness of the chair, the touch of the faint breeze from the window that played upon his cheek. The book fascinated him, or more exactly, it was reassured him. In a sense, it told him nothing that was new, but that was part of the attraction. It was said he what he would have said if it had been possible for him to set his scattered thoughts in order. It was the product of a mind similar to his own, but enormously more powerful, more systematic, less fear-ridden. The best books, he perceived, are those that tell you what you know already. He had just turned back to chapter 1 when he heard Julia's footstep on the stair and started out of his chair to meet her. She dumped her down tool bag, her brown tool bag on the floor and flung herself into his arms. It was more than a week since they had seen one another. "I've got the book," he said as they disentangled themselves. "Oh, you've got it? Good," she said without much interest, and almost immediately knelt down beside the oil stove to make the coffee. They did not return to the subject until they had been in bed for half an hour. The evening was just cool enough to make it worthwhile to pull up the counterpane. From below came the familiar sound of singing and the scrape of boots on the flagstones. The brawny, red-armed woman whom Winston had seen there on his first visit was almost a fixture in the yard. There seemed to be no hour of daylight when she was not marching to and fro between the washtub and the line, alternately gaggling herself with clothes pegs and breaking forth into lusty song. Julia had settled down on her side and seemed to be already on the point of falling asleep. He reached out for the book, which was lying on the floor, and sat up against the bedhead. "We must read it," he said. "You too. All members of the Brotherhood have to read it." "You read it," said she said with her eyes shut. "Read it aloud. That's the best way. Then you can explain it to me as you go." The clock's hand said 6, meaning 18. They had 3 or 4 hours ahead of them. He propped the book against his knees and began reading. Chapter 1! Oh my god, we can skip the meta book. Ignores his strength. Who voted yes? Who voted yes? It's like almost time to finish the stream. You know what? I'm going to finish for today. Now, I'm going to thank for the only person who voted on this poll. The results may change. Yeah, thank you very much. Hell yeah. But anyways, yeah, so, I don't have much to say, but I will give a summary next stream before we start reading chapter 10. Yeah, we are did it! We saved the stream from the long thing. Come on! The meta book is so long. You know what? I'm gonna spin away. I'm gonna flip a coin. You know what? Flip a coin. So I will summon our coin. Do not be concerned about the ads. There is no ad block in OBS, and I'm very sorry for the insane amount of widgets. But let's okay. So heads is yes, tails is no. Yes, we will skip the meta book, and I will provide a summary next stream. And yeah, that's basically the stream. I'm done with the stream today. I'll go.